A man walks into a bar. Every door is covered by cameras. And 20 years later, he still hasn't walked back out. Somewhere in a police archive in Columbus, Ohio, there's a piece of security footage that Sergeant John Hurst, the detective who led this case, has said he watched so many times it started showing up in his dreams. He knows it frame by frame, face by face. And every single time, he comes away with the exact same conclusion. Every person who walked into that bar on the night of March 31st, 2006 can be seen walking back out. Every single one, except Brian Shaffer. He was 27, a medical student, a guy with a flight booked to Miami, and, his friends believe, a ring in his pocket to propose to his girlfriend. And somewhere between an escalator and a door, he simply stopped existing. There's no body, no struggle, no exit caught on tape. Just an empty space where a person used to be. And, as you'll see later in this video, a name police have never made public, tied to a house they quietly dug up years later. So if unsolved cases that somehow keep getting stranger are your thing, hit subscribe before we go in, because this one earns it.
Here's what actually happened. Brian Shaffer didn't fit the profile of someone who runs. Second-year medical student at Ohio State. Well-liked, steady, dependable. He had a Pearl Jam logo tattooed on his arm. The band meant that much to him. He used to joke about starting his own band someday. He had a girlfriend, Alexis Wagner, and a trip to Miami booked for just days later. Friends would later say they suspected he was going to propose on that trip. By every measure, Brian's life was moving forward. But 3 weeks before he disappeared, something cracked. His mother, Renee, died after a long battle with a rare bone marrow cancer. Brian was close to her. The grief was still raw. Friends insist he showed no signs of being suicidal. He was sad, he was grieving, but he was still showing up, still making plans, still counting down the days to Miami. Which is exactly what makes what happened next so hard to explain. It was Friday, March 31st, 2006, the first night of spring break. Brian had dinner that evening with his father, Randy, at a local steakhouse. His father would later say Brian seemed exhausted, worn down from a week of cramming for exams. He privately wondered if his son should even go out that night. He never said it out loud. Later, Brian met up with his friend and former roommate, Clint Florence. The two of them went bar hopping through the University District. A normal night, the kind thousands of college kids have had. They drank, they talked. At some point, they linked up with a third friend, Meredith Reed, who joined them for the rest of the night. Eventually, all three ended up back at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a popular campus spot, since closed. It was around 1:15 in the morning. And this is where the timeline turns unbearably precise. At approximately 1:55 a.m., security cameras near the bar's entrance capture Brian standing by the escalator, talking with two women he'd met earlier that night, Brighton Satko and Amber Ruick. He looks relaxed, casual. Nothing in his body language suggests fear or distress or a plan to leave. Then he turns around and walks back inside. That is the last confirmed image of Brian Shaffer that exists anywhere on Earth. Here's the part that keeps investigators up at night.
The Ugly Tuna Saloona had, for all practical purposes, one usable entrance, and it was covered by security cameras. There was a second, service exit, but it opened directly onto an active construction site, a maze of equipment and barriers that would have been difficult to navigate, even stone sober. When the bar closed for the night, Clint and Meredith couldn't find Brian anywhere. They called his phone. Nothing. They checked outside. Nothing. Eventually, they assumed he must have already left without them, and they went home. But when investigators later went back through the footage, camera by camera, hour by hour, they found something that still unsettles anyone who hears it. Every patron who walked into that bar that night can be identified on camera walking back out. Every one of them, except Brian Shaffer. He isn't caught slipping out a side door. He isn't seen getting into a car or stumbling down the street or doing anything at all. The last frame anyone has of him shows a man calmly walking back into a bar he apparently never came out of. When Brian didn't show up for his flight to Miami on April 3rd, Alexis knew something was deeply wrong. She filed a missing person report, and what followed became one of the largest searches in Columbus history. Police interviewed more than 100 people. They searched the bar. They searched the construction site next door. They sent cadaver dogs along the river that runs through the city. Search parties combed the area for months, then years. A reward fund eventually grew to $100,000. Classmates, friends, and family spent countless hours looking, some of them for decades. They found nothing. No activity on his phone, no charges on his credit cards, no withdrawals from his bank account. His apartment sat untouched, nothing missing, nothing disturbed. It was as though Brian Shaffer had simply vanished into thin air at 1:55 in the morning on April 1st, 2006. Then, 2.5 years later, tragedy struck this family again. In September 2008, Brian's father, Randy, was outside near his home during a windstorm when a tree limb came down on top of him. He was killed instantly. In the span of a few years, this family had lost a mother to cancer, a son to a bar he never walked out of, and now a father to a falling tree branch. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too cruel to be real, but it is.
And in the aftermath of Randy's death, something strange happened. A message appeared on the online guest book for his memorial page. It read, "I miss you, Dad. Love, Brian." The account listed its location as the U.S. Virgin Islands. For a moment, it seemed almost impossible, a sign of life, however small. Investigators traced it. It had been posted from a public computer at a library in Franklin County, Ohio. A hoax, just another false hope in a case that had already collected dozens of them. There was one thread, though, that investigators kept pulling on, one that has never fully let go. Meredith Reed agreed to take a polygraph. She passed. Clint Florence, the friend Brian had spent that entire night with, refused. Not once, at least twice. He eventually retained a lawyer before answering any further questions. Investigators later admitted there were what they called odd dynamics in the friend group around that time. No one was ever named a suspect. No charges were ever filed. But it's a detail that has followed this case for nearly 2 decades, whispered about in forums and podcasts by people who can't quite let it go. And neither, it seems, can Brian's own family. Here's something that only recently came to light. Back in 2006, 2 different people with no apparent connection to each other gave Columbus police the same name. Both said this person may have harmed Brian or knew something about what happened to him. One of those 2 tipsters had been out with Brian that very night. For years, nothing public came of it. Then in 2020, when the case landed on a new detective's desk, that same name resurfaced. Investigators quietly searched a house near Lane Avenue, digging into the basement and yard connected to that individual. Cell phone records showed Brian's phone had been triangulated to a string of locations across the city for weeks after he vanished, and that data is part of what police pointed toward that address in the first place. To this day, police have never released that name. No charges, no public statement, just silence and a basement that was dug up years after the fact. And that silence hasn't sat well with the internet. People online have spent years trying to do what police won't, put a name to this. In 2024, that hunger for an answer spilled out of forums and into a real courtroom. A pair of Ohio brothers, no criminal charges and by every public record no connection to this case, say an anonymous Reddit user spent months naming them online as the people responsible, not just for Brian's disappearance, for other unsolved cases too. The brothers are now suing that user for defamation, demanding the post come down and a court declare formally that the accusations were baseless. 2 decades unsolved, and this case is still generating headlines, one from a courtroom and one from a house that's already been dug up.
So what actually happened to him? Investigators and the family who has spent 20 years searching keep circling back to the same handful of theories, none proven, all of them haunting. The first, Brian walked away on purpose. Between the grief of losing his mother, the pressure of medical school, and whatever weight he was carrying that night, some believe he simply chose to vanish, to leave everything behind and start over somewhere else, under a different name, far from anyone who knew him. It's a theory some investigators still hold today. The second, something happened to him that night, that whatever tension existed within that small circle of friends went further than anyone has ever been able to prove,
and that Brian never left on his own terms at all. It's the theory that gained the most weight when that basement search came to light, proof that whatever police found or didn't find, they took that name seriously enough to dig for it. The third, simpler and sadder, some kind of accident tied to that construction site next door, and his remains have simply never been recovered in all the years since. No physical evidence has ever surfaced to confirm any of the three. 20 years later, Columbus police still consider this case open. In 2021, investigators released an age progression image, an artist's rendering of what Brian might look like now, in his 40s, in case he's out there somewhere, alive. In 2020, a photograph surfaced of a homeless man in Tijuana, Mexico, who bore an eerie resemblance to Brian. Hope spread fast through the online communities following the case. The FBI ran facial recognition analysis. It wasn't him.
As for Alexis, the woman Brian was likely planning to propose to, she carried the weight of that unanswered question for years. But life, eventually, found a way forward. She went on to finish medical school, remarried, and started a family of her own. Today, she practices as an OB-GYN in Ohio, quietly living out the future she and Brian once dreamed about together, just without him in it. Somewhere between that escalator and the door, a 27-year-old man with a girlfriend waiting for him, a flight booked to Miami, and a life still very much in motion, simply vanished. And 20 years on, no one has ever been able to explain how. If cases like this, the ones that don't add up no matter how many times you turn them over, are what keep you coming back, that's exactly what this channel does. Hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you.